You're listening to the Connection Care Community Podcast, a podcast designed to help you understand your body more deeply and feel more confident navigating your hormones, cycle, and fertility. Each episode offers grounded, research-informed guidance and integrative tools to support hormone health, embodied awareness, and informed choice. If you're seeking clarity, connection, and a more trusting relationship with your body, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Here's your host, the founder of Connection Care Therapy, Majida.
Hello and welcome to the Connection Care Community Podcast. My name is Majida, and today we'll be talking about movement, and not the version of the conversation that gets into things like burning calories or hitting a certain type of number on your app or screen. I want to talk about why so many women do everything correctly in their fitness journey, right? They may be consistent or disciplined or pushing through, but still end up feeling exhausted, stuck, or even sometimes injured. What I hope to offer today is a different framework, and one that once it starts to click, we tend to change the way that we approach movement and exercise in the long run. So if you grew up in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s, like myself, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, we who survived that experience and its fitness culture can remember pretty clearly that we were handed some really, I will use the word interesting set of instructions. And oftentimes those instructions look like push harder or more is better or override fatigue. Rest is just something that you're going to squeeze in reluctantly and even sometimes apologetically, like it needed to be justified, as if your body asking for a break was an inconvenience rather than useful information. We grew up in the boss babe era, the hustle culture era, and it's important to know that that approach and the way that it trained us around moving our bodies was not at all neutral. For many of us, it created a relationship with exercise that is and can often be pretty exhausting to maintain. And it can actually quietly erode what it's meant to do. Underneath the surface, it can start to create some misalignments that are actually antithetical to what we're hoping to achieve. And so here's what is completely overlooked in this conversation, not surprisingly, is that our body runs on a cycle. If we are cycling beings, if we are having menstrual cycles, we run on a cyclical rhythm. And that rhythm is meaningful. It shifts the way that our energy is available. It shifts the way that recovery happens. It shifts things like joint stability and stress tolerance throughout the month. So expecting yourself to perform the same way on cycle day 7 as you did on cycle day 21 is kind of like expecting a plant to grow the exact same way in the summer versus the winter. The conditions are genuinely different. And cycle-aligned movement is going to work best when you're saying yes to connecting with the reality of our systems instead of pushing against it. It really changes things, not just physically, but in terms of how you actually feel about exercise and feel about movement over time. Part of my background, which I've obviously transitioned into working with hormone health and fertility conversations now, but I started a lot of my nutritional coaching work and what have you in working with professional athletes, tennis players specifically. And this was such a breakthrough for many of my elite athletes that I was working with, both college level and professional in Houston, Texas. And it changed the way that my female athletes really understood their rhythms and their flows when it came to their elite performance. And so with that, these same principles can 100% be applied to working with those of us who are not functioning on an elite athletic level. It can really be such a big piece of information as to how we just structure our everyday lives and support us in developing a much more loving and joyful relationship with movement overall. So if you've joined me before, or if you're into these kinds of conversations, you have some level of familiarity with the menstrual cycle. I'm going to go through the different phases of the menstrual cycle and talk about what kind of movement generally, not always, not with everyone, but generally is most supportive during that phase of your cycle, depending on what is generally going on with your hormones. Now, it's always important to note, right? Big disclaimer is that if you're navigating any kind of hormone health concern, then your body's relationship to its hormones are not going to oftentimes look in the way that it would during a typical, what we call a typical cycle. So what I'm sharing is a framework, and what I always encourage is that you start to learn how to track your cycle and start to understand what your individual physiology is like. And based upon that, then some of these conversations can be worked with on an individual level instead of you just generalizing. However, for education, it can be very, very useful to have these general markers. So starting out with the first phase of our cycle, the cycle is broken up into two phases. We have our follicular phase, we have our luteal phase. Follicular phase starts from first day of menstruation and goes all the way up to ovulation. And then once ovulation occurs, we're in the second part of our cycle, our luteal phase. Oftentimes we will see the cycle so broken up into three components, with the menstrual phase and the ovulatory phase. Even though they're underneath the umbrella of the follicular phase, those two phases are oftentimes taken out as a sub phase underneath the follicular phase on their own, because they can have somewhat slightly unique needs, and we'll talk about that. So starting out with the follicular phase, roughly it's going to be the first half of your cycle, as I said. It's going to be characterized by estrogen. That's the big one. Estrogen does a lot. It improves our insulin sensitivity. It's going to support glycogen storage. It is going to support things like collagen synthesis, and even supporting in how we navigate pain tolerance. This is why it's natural for many who cycle to feel stronger or sharper, perhaps more physically capable during that first part of their cycle after menstruation. All right. So there's a biological reason for this energy. Your body is in what can be known as a building phase. It's being building. Your womb is building its endometrial lining, and also this is a time when it could be very primed for muscle building, momentum, adaptation. Okay. So then around ovulation, which for some is more so like in the middle of their cycle, the typical day of ovulation is oftentimes listed as cycle day 14, but it's important to know that most don't actually ovulate on cycle day 14. I personally, for example, ovulate anywhere between cycle day, the earliest I've ever ovulated is cycle day 12, and the latest I've ever ovulated is around cycle day 15, 16. All right. So most of us have a window of when ovulation occurs, because ovulation is a very responsive time in our cycle. But to get back to movement. All right. So around ovulation, estrogen and testosterone both rise, right? Both can oftentimes be at their peak in a menstruating body. Yes, we who have female bodies also produce testosterone. Not as much as our male counterparts do, but we do have testosterone that is produced. And our testosterone, it makes a big deal for things like egg quality and muscle building and libido. Right? So also, when it comes to movement, those two, estrogen, testosterone, very, very exceptional time for the high intensity workouts or strength training and performance, neurologically and physically. Many are at their peak here. If you've ever noticed that certain workouts can sometimes feel like you're just in more of a flow state, maybe even the word effortless, right? For some, maybe. Rarely do my workouts feel effortless, but for some, there's that ability to much more easily enter into a flow state when it comes to your movement practices. The middle of the month may be that time for many. So then we have ovulation, and the egg goes and does whatever it's on this journey to do, and what's left behind is called our corpus luteum, which is why we have what's called the luteal stage, which is the second half of the cycle after ovulation through to before your next menstrual cycle, your next period starts. So progesterone, remember, first part of the cycle, estrogen is dominant. Second part of the cycle, progesterone is dominant. And our core body temperature in response to progesterone heats up the body. Right? Core body temperature rises, heart rate slightly increases. The nervous system operates with a lower threshold for stress, meaning that it's not uncommon for the same stressors, both mentally and emotionally, as well as physically, including exercise, can oftentimes just register as more intense during that part in your cycle. It may mean that recovery takes longer. It may mean that inflammation is slightly higher during that time. The workout that felt energizing even a couple of weeks ago can start to feel like a bit of a burden during this stage of the cycle. That's not uncommon. Hint, hint, if there's anyone who is in the perimenopausal or menopausal stage of life out there who's listening to this, or you know anyone in that ageist stage of life, know that that's a really big transitional time, because oftentimes these hormones that we're talking about, estrogen and progesterone, tend to start really plummeting. They start to be at their lowest. So one of the things that many in that age and stage of life are navigating is, I'm doing the exact same thing I've always done, but now I'm gaining weight. Now I'm gaining weight around hormone sensitive areas like the belly or the hips or the breast, for example. But that's a conversation for another day and another podcast. Even though I usually start with menstruation, because a little cycle tracking tip, cycle day 1 is the first day of your menstruation. Right? So if you're ever wondering, how do I know where I'm at in my menstrual cycle? Cycle day 1, the first day of your full bleed, is the first day of your cycle. Okay. So generally I start with talking about cycle day 1, menstruation. This time I start with overall follicular phase, and we're ending on talking about menstruation, the menstrual period, and what that can mean for movement. Inflammatory markers at this point in your cycle are oftentimes at their peak, and immune function can dip. So your body is already doing significant physiological work, even on a rest day. So it's important to know your body and know what your body's needs are. I remember, though, that I went through a phase where actually my menstrual cycle was a time of enormous energy for me, and I love to do belly dancing and movement and things during that time. So I say all of this to just share a framework, and a framework that supports you in understanding the ebbs and flows of your hormones and how they relate to your cycle. However, what this means for you individually, how you individually respond, is something that is part of the self-discovery of this work. But one thing I will say about the menstrual cycle, I remember I had, back in the day, this shaman who I used to do sweat lodges with would oftentimes share about the power of the menstrual cycle. The lodges that she would lead, oftentimes she would say that we don't really do a lot of transformative practices around the menstrual cycle, because inherently the menstrual cycle is a transformative practice in and of itself. And so just a little bit of framing there for those of you who, that speaks to part of your language as well, is that just our menstrual time is a really powerful time. And it's a time where it makes sense to take rest, to slow down. I still personally like to walk and allow, especially hip movements during that time in my cycle. Complete staticness is not for everyone, but for some, that may be the real poignant time, right? The real super potent time in your cycle to take some rest. Okay. So when you apply the exact same intensity across all of these phases, I want to just offer a contemplation, right? A question maybe for you to ask. Is this actually what discipline looks like, or am I participating in something that may be a biological mismatch? And some of the ways that you can know if you're dealing with a mismatch is if you're dealing with things, navigating experiences like stubborn fatigue. If you're stalling in progress, you have certain movement and health goals and you're stalling in that progress. Increased injuries. If your cycles are irregular or you're experiencing full body burnout that doesn't seem to resolve no matter how much sleep you get, especially if sleep is being affected. So if you've experienced any of those things, it may be very supportive for you to start just looking into your movement practices and understanding them in terms of your cycle. So I'm going to gently step into another area that may not get the kind of attention that it deserves, but a lot of those who come to cycle syncing practices and are working towards cycle aligned movement after years of relating to exercise in a way to primarily manage their bodies or manage themselves can oftentimes find like the cycle aligned aspect of things to be a little disarming. So there are many who may come to this work and they're doing so out of a sense of maybe control, right? I want to offset eating or control my size or earn rest or outrun anxiety or grief or stress that may have felt too big to sit with. And there's something that can feel very productive about that pattern. I would even use a word like virtuous. You're being consistent, you're showing up, you're being disciplined. However, it's not uncommon for me to work with many who have that worldview, and underneath it, their nervous system is running on a different program. It's running on a program that is staying activated. And so when movement is driven by a need to, let's say, control, right, rather than a desire to support one system, it's not uncommon to see, as I talked about earlier, the opposite impact of what we would want our movement practices to be. Cortisol might stay elevated, for example, and cortisol spikes and jumps that don't resolve, right? They resolve the stress cycle that's not resolving. It means that the body can start to register exercise as one more stressor that it has to survive rather than something that can help it recover and adapt and strengthen. So recovery then in those situations, it's uncommon for me to see that a person is navigating recovery that is stalling or progress that's stalling, meaning that they're doing everything by the book, but their body, right, is still not responding. And this is where I say that the way that we approach these conversations, cycle aligned movement included, really does matter. Perhaps instead of asking yourself, how hard can I go today? It might be interesting to explore a question like, what kind of movement would actually support my body today? And of course, something like that sounds really simple. However, that shift in orientation from pushing against your body to working with it can have a really profound cumulative effect over time, where movement starts to feel less adversarial. And when it does, then the body can begin to respond in ways that is harder. The harder is better approach, right? And the harder is better approach starts to be more so questioned. So I hope I framed that conversation around control and movement well. These topics can be very sensitized, and if you're navigating something that requires more support when it comes to either your nutrition practices, your nourishment practices, your food practices, as well as your movement practices, it's okay to get support from those who can aid you in reflecting on these practices and making sure that you have the container and the nuance that is needed. Right? This podcast goes out to a lot of people, and I am doing my best to hold the container responsibly when it comes to these conversations around our body and movement and how we engage with our body. So, with that, I want to talk about rest and say very plainly that rest is not weakness. That rest is a natural and essential part of our health and our needs around the way that our physiology needs rest in order to function properly. You already heard me talk about the late luteal phase. You also heard me talk about menstruation, when inflammatory markers are naturally elevated and the nervous system is naturally more sensitive to the experience of stress. And in these windows of time, exploring gentler movement practices such as walking or mobility work or restorative yoga or easeful swimming, these can oftentimes support hormone balance much more effectively than intense training. So strategic rest, there's amazing, her name is escaping me now, but she's called, I believe, the Rest Bishop. And she talks about how rest is an act of revolution. Right? Self-care and rest are profound, deep acts of revolution. And so in offering that when you rest and integrate strategic rest, you can actually do more to preserve your strength gains, that there's certain life ages and stages where it's absolutely essential to ensure that we have proper recovery days between certain types of activities, strength training, and what have you, to ensure that our system has enough time to fully recover. And that time to fully recover really supports us in maintaining the progress that we are making and ensuring that our body has the full experience of restoration. So when you allow recovery during these higher inflammation periods and times in your cycle, you reduce your risk of injury, you support your more regulated cycles, you support the maintenance of more steadier energy, and also building the long-term resilience in a way that constant output simply is not going to produce. Okay, so long story short, the goal is not constant output, the goal is sustainable strength. And as you navigate this journey and this experience of integrating more of these conversations into your actual action and lifestyle, that's something that you, I really feel pretty confident that you'll discover for yourself. So I offer in my Substack a simple framework that you can utilize for yourself. You can check it out. It goes through the different phases and stages of your cycle, and just supports you making informed decisions as to how you want to start exploring if this is something that's new to you, or if this isn't something that's new to you, perhaps, refining or playing with the different stages of your cycle and what that means to your capacity around movement. So please be sure to go on over to my Substack, check that out. Please also be sure to subscribe if you're stopping by, or if you're listening to this on YouTube or something else. Please do subscribe, leave a comment, say hello. I would love to hear from you. It's nice to know who's out there and who's listening. I want to be clear with what I'm sharing on here on Substack. As I've said before, it's not about memorizing a formula. It's about just getting some useful tips and frameworks as to where you can even start, where you can start asking questions around your cycle, and where you feel supported, or where you feel clear, or where you feel capable, or wrung out, or depleted. Like, what does your cycle actually mean for you when it comes to your energy levels and capacity? So let's see, I'm looking at my notes here to see if we have anything else to share. I have a little brief sentence here around consistency does not mean sameness, right? Consistency and sameness are not the same thing, and that's worth just contemplating what that means for a moment, right? Consistency can look like showing up in alignment with where your body is actually at. not every single Tuesday I need to do this exact same thing. So that's reframing around consistency that I just wanted to put out there as well. I think that that's all that I have for this podcast today. I really appreciate you all joining me here. Please, again, head on over to my Substack for more resources. I also, for those who opt in on my website, for now, I'm going to be changing some things in my back office around. But for now, I offer a pretty robust free resource library that includes an ebook called Hormone Harmony that is all about cycle syncing, as well as some other cycle syncing resources for you to check out for your own education. I also teach this body of work, and how to track your cycle and FAM and so much more. We either already have put out or will be in the process of putting out my course, The Cycle Connection, which will talk about how movement and food and stress regulation, hormone rhythms, and so much more are connected to your cycle, and teaching you how to read your cycle in a way that supports your hormone health and fertility goals. So thank you again for joining me. I look forward to hearing from you next time, and continuing to share this amazing journey. And that's all we have for today. So thanks again for being here. And as always, stay connected.
That does it for this episode of the Connection Care Community Podcast with Majida. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you're leaving with a fresh perspective on your body and overall well-being, along with practical tools you can integrate into daily life. The support doesn't stop here. Be sure to connect with us online at connectioncaretherapy.com for more resources to guide you on your journey. You can also find us on Substack and connect with Majida on Instagram at Majida Sai'da. Remember to rate, review, and share this podcast. And most importantly, stay connected.